right. Hi, everyone. So great to be here on this snowy afternoon. My name is Deborah Krieger. I am the exhibit and program coordinator at the Museum of Work and Culture. This is our first Valley Talk of our 2022 series, and we've got a really great lineup for you. Yeah, Anne Conway is in Canada. She is traveling back right now, so I will be sort of taking over this MC duty. Apologies for that. If anybody wants to take a minute and just drop where they're watching this from in the chat, we have a really great crowd today. We have 61 people in this chat right now. So if everybody just wants to quickly write in the chat where they're coming from, that would be wonderful. Take a minute or two to do that.
Wow, it's people from all over the country.
Yeah. Different states. Great Rhode Island representation. Whoa, he's really in Salesville. All right, well, before we get started, I'm just going to give a little info on Patrick. Patrick Crowley is the Secretary Treasurer of the Rhode Island AFL-CIO, representing 80,000 working women and men across Rhode Island. He's been a union organizer for 25 years, working at different times for the Teamsters Union, the Hospital Workers Union, and the National Education Association of Rhode Island. He holds master's degrees in labor studies from the University of Massachusetts Amherst and in history from the University of Rhode Island. Patrick serves on the boards of several organizations, including Climate Jobs Rhode Island, the Institute for Labor Studies and Research, the United Way of Rhode Island's Community Advisory Board, and the Board of Directors of the Museum of Work and Culture Foundation. All right, Patrick, take it away.
Thank you, Deborah. And thank you, everyone, for being here this afternoon. The title of this presentation is called The Battle of the Gravestones and the Saylesville Massacre of 1934. And it is about a worker strike in my neighborhood of Salesville, Rhode Island, back in the early 1930s. And it is part of a book that I wrote about the strike, which is called The Battle of the Gravestones and the Saylesville Massacre. So to get started here, what I'd like to do is show everyone a quick video of an actual newsreel of the strike from September of 1934.
The industrial dispute has now reached an extremely serious position. The strikers, numbering over 4,000 under cover of darkness, attacked the mills. When morning broke, combat still continued against 500 men of the National Guard who were vainly attempting to quell the riot. Police and guardsmen found it necessary to use tear and nausea gas bombs, the fumes choking and blinding friend and foe alike, and even penetrating into the adjoining houses. Casualties were numerous, and in addition to wounds caused by flying stones thrown by the strikers, 3 deaths are already reported. The authorities were eventually compelled to use firearms. The ambulance company of the Rhode Island National Guard set up a field hospital which was quickly working to capacity. The Mossishook Cemetery and the Central Falls saw some of the fiercest fighting. Both strikers and police took advantage of the gravestones as a protection from the missiles, and neither side could claim an advantage, and it's feared that greater loss of life will ensue.
So, pretty exciting events that took place right in my neighborhood here in Salesville. So, for folks from that might not be familiar with where Salesville is geographically, it is part of the town of Lincoln, Rhode Island. And the Salesville neighborhood in particular is right at that area between Central Falls and Lincoln proper. And that's the area known as Salesville. And I'll talk a little bit more about the village of Salesville in a minute. But one of the parts of my story here is about revisiting this strike. So This strike is not that it's unknown, but it really has not been part of a broader historiography of the 1930s. And I found out about this story really by walking around the streets in my neighborhood. Like a lot of neighborhoods in Rhode Island of a certain age, if you walk, across the sidewalks, you may notice that embedded within the sidewalks are these little copper medallions that have WPA on them. Because many of the streets and sidewalks in northern Rhode Island in particular, but really across the entire state of Rhode Island, were actually built in the 1930s thanks to the New Deal programs from President Roosevelt. Well, when I found one of these medallions in the street right across from my house, it just got me curious, because down at the end of the street was this big building that just looked like one of those old abandoned mills. And it turns out that this mill building down at the end of my street, the Salesville Bleachery, has a very, very interesting story to tell. And we'll get into that in a minute. But there's really three different reasons why I think this story is important for both historians and people that are generally interested in Rhode Island. And the first part is we haven't really told the story well yet. Oftentimes when you hear stories of strikes or industrial disputes or labor actions, they get told in this heroic hagiography where the strikers are this valiant effort, and sometimes they win, sometimes they lose. That wasn't really the case here. This was not a case of heroic union members taking on a powerful employer, and despite a valiant effort, they just happened to lose. The workers at the Salesville Bleachery never actually went on strike. The union that was involved with the strike didn't represent the workers, and frankly, the union had no control over the situation in the streets of Salesville. And as soon as things went bad, which we'll talk about in a little bit, the union tried to distance itself away from what took place. The other reason why I think the story of Salesville is very important to tell as Rhode Islanders is because the political side of the story has been left out of the narrative. Right? I mean, this is Rhode Island. Everything is political in this state. We know that. And while the existing historiography does talk about the role that that Governor T.F. Green played in the strike, it takes Green's version of the story at face value and has embedded it within the narrative. And as it turns out in my research, the story that Governor Green told about the strike at the time is completely made up. I mean, it's just wrong. It's just false. And what Green tried to get across to the people of Rhode Island, and it is embedded within the history now, is that he tried to walk this middle path between the company and the workers, and he was forced, reluctantly to call in the troops to quell the strike, only because things got out of hand. The reality is that he bungled the whole thing. He was completely inept. His response was inept. He was bullied by the company. He was bullied by the security forces. He couldn't get even his own party, the Democratic Party, to support what he wanted to do about the strike. And in the end, he ended up, probably causing the death of working people on the streets of Rhode Island by his ineptitude. The third reason why I think this is important is because it's important to acknowledge that this strike was lost, that the workers lost this strike. And I say that it's important to know that the workers lost this strike, mostly because we don't often talk about strikes that get broken, that lose. And especially when we talk about the Depression era, there's all of this heroic labor activity. This strike, because it was a loss, is one of the reasons why it's not quite disappeared, but it's not talked about as broadly as it might otherwise be. So, get my thing here. One thing I wanted to point out about one of the reasons why I think the story of the Saylesville Massacre is so hard to understand, or has been so inadequately talked about, is that there are very few sources that primary sources about the strike that are in a way useful to historians. So as most people in Rhode Island know, the paper of record in our state is the Providence Journal. The stories about the strike in the Providence Journal are virtually unreadable. The pictures are great, and we'll see some of them in the presentation today. But the stories themselves, the articles about the strike, are incoherent, and that's being generous. For whatever reason, the stories have no linear structure to them. Events that happen at the beginning of the day turn to events that happened 2 days earlier, and then go back to events that happen on the particular day of the issue of the paper, with no clear understanding of why those leaps in storytelling take place. Now, part of that is understandable. This was a major event in the state of Rhode Island. The entire state was captivated by what was going on in Salesville at the time. And the newspaper obviously put getting information, not necessarily facts, but the story out there as fast as possible without taking the time to edit it. But you flash forward 75, 80 years, and as a historian or as other historians trying to find out the details, it's almost impossible to try to make sense of it, especially when you don't have the physical copies of the paper and try to read things on microfilm or microfiche. Luckily, by the time I was working on this, a lot of the newspapers were computerized, so it was easier to find. The other reason why this story is not relatively known is that the union involved with the strike, the United Textile Workers of America, completely disappeared not very long after the strike. It merged, it was consumed in other unions, and it was also a very small union to begin with. And then several years or a few years after the Salesville Strike, the United Textile Workers of America actually divided into two other smaller unions when one branch went off to become part of the American Federation of Labor, and another branch grew into the newer Congress of Industrial Organizations, the CIO. So this small union became smaller through Civil War. So let me talk a little bit about Salesville itself. So Salesville, this village, was built around the Salesville Bleachery, and it was founded by the Sales family. So the founder of the Salesville Bleachery was named William Sales. And what William Sales did was build this big company as part of the cotton textile industry in the state of Rhode Island. Now, you might be asking yourself, what exactly is a bleachery? Well, it is what it sounds like. I mean, if you remember, or if you can think about what a bleachery does, it literally takes raw cotton and processes it to turn it white. When cotton is picked up, it is, it's kind of dirty. It's got all this dirt and seeds and everything in it. And what the bleachery did was, in the supply chain of the time, was take the cotton and help process it further so it would become, able to be turned into fabric. So what William Sales did was found this company right on the banks of the Massachusetts River in Salesville. A little bit later, he partnered with his brother Frederick Sales, and by the time Frederick joined the company in the middle of the 19th century, the Salesville Bleachery became the biggest bleachery in the world. And it was founded right here in Salesville, Rhode Island. A little bit later, as the two brothers started to get older, they invited their Frank Sales, who was Frederick's son, into the business. And it was Frank Sales who had sold the company just before the Depression started. Now, some interesting things about the Sales brothers. They were, Frederick Sales was the first mayor of the city of Pawtucket. They ran this whole village as if it was a paternalistic society. They banned saloons, they set up a clubhouse, they had marching bands, they even had a professional soccer team, all associated with the Salesville Bleachery. On the screen here, you'll see this small little picture. This was a railroad that they built for the villagers. It was actually at the time the smallest railroad in the world. So the whole village was centered around this family. And as you can see, as we'll talk about as the story goes on, what happens is that the paternalism of the family really, plays a role in the strike. Now that said, even though this was a very paternalistic neighborhood, labor strife was not unknown at the Salesville Bleachery. And in fact, in 1905, the workers went on strike and won. They were hoping for a big pay raise, but what they were hoping to really do is what they ended up winning was a reduction in their hours and a small raise. And then 17 years later, in 1922, there was a big regional textile strike that also impacted the sales workers. The workers there, it's not clear if they went out on strike in 1922. Again, the Providence Journal's reporting on it isn't really clear, but it's important to know that even though the paternalism of the sales family was important to the workers, labor strife was not unknown amongst them. Now, in a very way, it's important to understand that the Salesville strike was a very Rhode Island thing. However, it was part of a national textile strike. 500,000 workers across the entire country left their jobs back in September of 1934. And the strike was located all throughout New England, New Jersey, the southern part of the state, and even out into the Midwest. Everywhere where there was cotton textile production, the strike took place. However, it really was centered here in Rhode Island. The man up in the upper left-hand corner of your screen, his name is Thomas McMahon. Tom McMahon was the president of the United Textile Workers. He was a Rhode Islander. Funny thing about Tom is he never really knew how old he was. He was an immigrant from Ireland, and there were no records of his birth back in Ireland. So he was never really clear whether or not he was born in 1868 or 1870. And the stories within the historiography often have these little anecdotes about his children making fun of him for not being able to know when his birthday was. To his immediate right is another man named Francis Gorman. Frank Gorman was also a Rhode Islander. Frank was the vice president of the National Textile Workers Union, and he too was an immigrant. He was an immigrant from England. He was about 10 years younger than Tom McMahon, but he was the guy that was in charge of actually running the day-to-day strike activity across the entire country. In the upper right-hand corner is a man named Joseph Sylvia. Joe Silva was the person who ran the strike here in Rhode Island, but he didn't run it just for Rhode Island. He ran the New England part of the strike out of Pawtucket, Rhode Island. To the lower left-hand corner that's T.F. Green. That's Governor Theodore Francis Green, named after our state airport is named after T.F. Green. Now, the interesting thing about Green is that this picture of him later in life, he was elected to the governorship in 1932. And Green had run for office in Rhode Island almost every single year since at the turn of the century. So like from 1901 through 1932, he ran for office every year and never won. He was like this, not quite a laughingstock, but he was really, not taken seriously within the political establishment. And as folks might recall, up until the 1930s, Rhode Island was a Republican state. We were dominated by the Republican Party. And we'll talk a little bit about how that shift happened at the end here. In the lower middle part of the screen, you'll see what the major player here in the 1934 Salesville strike, and that's the National Guard. And you might hear me call the National Guard a couple of different names. It really wasn't known as the National Guard the way we know it today. The other way they were referred to as the state militia. It was not the well-organized force that we know today. It really was almost like an on-call service. And then on the last player to talk about here is the United Textile Workers of America. And that was the union that called the strike, and they were the ones that organized all of the activity. Now, one of the reasons for the strike back in 1934 was because for the first time in American history, working people were actually given the right to organize unions and bargain through representatives of their own choosing. In 1933, as part of the New Deal, President Roosevelt helped enact the National Industrial Recovery Act. You might remember, or you might still see some of these signs somewhere. I think we have one posted at the in the Museum of Work and Culture, actually. I think I remember seeing one of these Blue Eagle signs. But the NRA gave working people the right to form unions for the very first time, and at least the blessing of the federal government, at least in theory, gave them the right to organize. The problem was that in the National Industrial Recovery Act, the NRA, there was no mechanism to form a union. So folks that might not be familiar with the process today, if workers at a company or a factory or any kind of workplace in 2022 want to form a union, the federal government in private sector cases or the state of Rhode Island in public sector cases will literally go to the workplace, set up a ballot box, and hold an election. It's almost like going to your local town hall to vote on election day. It's a little bit more complicated than that, but at its essence, the workers take a vote, and if a majority want a union, you have a union. And then once the union election happens and the union wins, the union negotiates a contract with the employer. But in 1933, no one had figured out that step yet. So even though the law gave working people the right to organize, there was no mechanism to get the union involved. So workers went out on strike. And in 1934, there was a massive strike wave across the entire United States. I mean, there were major strikes in places like Toledo, in Minneapolis, Minnesota, in San Francisco. And all of these strikes were incredibly violent and incredibly confrontational, and it led to dozens of people being killed by security forces across the state, across the country. And as we'll see, that Rhode Island did not escape that problem. Now, one of the other reasons for the strike of the textile workers in 1934 was the working conditions that people faced. To the left on your screen it's a draper loom, and it's similar to the version of the looms that were in textile mills across the entire country, but they were especially popular here in Rhode Island. Now, this loom, as you can tell, I mean, this picture is from a little bit before 1934, but it wasn't that much more advanced. Doesn't look the safest, does it? I mean, there's no safety gear, there's all these moving parts that are exposed. And what would happen quite frequently is people would get their hands caught in these machines, they get their clothing caught in these machines, and it was really dangerous work. But not just dangerous, physically. These machines were loud. I mean, they were deafening loud. And as you can imagine, they were clunky, and they would move, and they would bounce. So you can imagine standing in front of a machine like this for 10 hours a day, 12 hours a day, sometimes 16 hours a day, 6 days a week. It did a number on people. Combine that with the effects of the Depression, which meant that working people were thrown out of the factories on a regular basis so that employers could cut costs. And what that led to was called the speed up. And this picture on the side here is kind of funny. It was an advertisement for companies that wanted to speed up work. But the speed up in the textile situation meant that instead of a working person having to control one loom, like we see here on the screen, they might have to be in charge of 2 looms, or 3 looms, or 4 looms, or 10 looms. So you can imagine someone who's, in this dirty, smelly, hot factory having to run up and down aisles of machinery to make sure that the looms are working properly and have the thread fitted in. I mean, it was just mentally, physically exhausting to do this kind of work. And what it did was it led to the conditions that made the 1934 strike happen. The strike started here in Rhode Island in the first week of September of 1934. And it was Labor Day that year was on September 4th. And that's when the strike officially happened. And you can see some pictures here of when the strike began. And initially, it seemed like as if it was a great success. You know, this picture up here on the upper left-hand side, the handsome-looking gentleman here on the left with the bow tie, that's Mortimer Sullivan, who was the mayor of Newport at the time. In the middle part, that's Joe Sylvia, and on the right, that's Tom McMahon from the strike. But initially, the strike was a success. The textile industry started to shut down, and by the end of the first week, 81 of the major mills in the state were shut, and 35,000 working people were out on strike. But initially, there was no picketing at the Salesville Bleachery. And this is where things start to get a little bit interesting. In Rhode Island, and really across the country, even though bleachery workers were an incredibly important part of the cotton textile industry, it was never really clear whether or not the bleachery itself was part of the strike. So the union, the UTW, did not represent any of the workers at the strike, except for a small, like handful of people in one of the box folding department. So the workers in Salesville, even though the strike was called, just continued to go to work because they didn't think that they were on strike. Now, however, at the end of the first week of September of 1934, things start to get a little bit crazy here in Salesville. Picketers start to show up at the factory, and they're met by these handsome-looking gentlemen. These are deputy sheriffs. Now, I know what you're thinking. Those can't be deputy sheriffs. But yes, those are deputy sheriffs. They were hired by the company to keep the Salesville Bleachery from being attacked during the strike. And what it really was this group of thugs that were armed with billy clubs and with basically sawed-off shotguns, and they would patrol around the entire facility in Salesville to make sure that none of the strike activity was going to be allowed onto the property. But instead, what happened was that because these guys showed up, it got the strikers' attention from other parts of the state, so they wanted to come and see what was going on. Why are all these thugs showing up in front of the Salesville Bleachery? And as it turns out, when you put all these guys in the same place at the same time, things start to get a little bit dangerous. So about 200 people start to picket in front of the Salesville Bleachery on the Friday of the first week of September in 1934. And what happens is some teenage boys in the neighborhood start throwing rocks. And when the neighborhood kids start throwing rocks at the deputy sheriffs wade into the crowd with their billy clubs and start whacking people across the head. Well, what happens next is that the strikers start to put the call out to their friends across the area, and now carloads and carloads of people start to show up in Salesville, and a near riot breaks out between the deputy sheriffs and the picketers. At some point, during the violence, the sheriff of Providence is actually it's the deputy sheriff of Providence. His name is a man named Herman Pastor. Steps out into the crowd and he literally reads the riot act. I know my mother, when I was a kid, she used to say, "I'm going to read you the riot act unless you behave." Well, they literally had a riot act that they would read to the people assembled on the streets, and it basically said, either get out of here or you face arrest. Well, what happens is that when a pastor starts to read the riot act to the people that are gathered in the area, people start throwing rocks back at him. And you can just imagine, so all hell breaks loose. So what happens is that Pastor has his men turn the fire hoses from the Salesville company onto the crowd and push them back away. The crowd, it was like this back and forth where they would retreat the deputy sheriffs would retreat, the picketers would start to throw rocks again, the deputy sheriffs would charge at them again, and this went back and forth throughout the night. And at some point, Pastor steps up into the crowd and then takes out his gun, and he waves his gun at the crowd, and the crowd goes silent. And Pastor says, either you knock it off and get out of here or you'll get this. And then the crowd, silence happens, and then all of a sudden someone in the back of the crowd says, that's all right, we can take it. The rocks start flying again, and the battle just goes back and forth throughout the night. And then at some point, and I'll give you a reason why I think this is the case, at some point later on in the evening, the crowd starts to filter away and peace is restored in the neighborhood of Salesville. Now, that was a Friday night, so that was the first Friday of the strike. Luckily for everyone involved, the strike was, the factory itself was closed over the weekend. And what happened over the weekend was Governor Green and all of his advisors were gathered at the State House, and they were hoping that, thankfully, the worst had passed, that no one had died yet, no one had got hurt, no one, at least seriously enough, and they were hoping that they had dodged a bullet when it came to any further activity. Unfortunately, that wasn't the case. So on Monday, when the Bleachery opened, there was some picketing outside, but they were greeted by a large number of security forces and things remained relatively quiet. However, at 3 o'clock in the afternoon on the Monday of September 10th we're at, as workers started to leave for left the day shift, so around 3 o'clock in the afternoon, they had to walk through the picket line to get to their houses. And it's not really clear where they were walking to, but it's probably walking from Lincoln into Central Falls. When they were walking through the picketers, what happened is that the picketers start to surround them. And no one knows who threw the first punch, but a fight breaks out. And as the fight breaks out amongst the picketers and the workers who are leaving the factory, the deputy sheriff start to wade into the crowd. And at first they start swinging their billy clubs and just knocking the heck out of people. Workers start to fall, workers get all bloody. But the workers start to outnumber the security forces, and the security guards, the deputy sheriffs, those thugs, start to get nervous, and they put away their billy clubs and they took out what's called their riot guns. Those are those sawed-off shotguns that I had mentioned. And they start shooting at the crowd with their riot guns. Now, a riot gun is it's exactly what it sounds like. So it's designed, or it was thought to be designed that it would be a non-lethal weapon. But if you use it in the right way, guess what? It's still going to be you're still shooting pellets at people with a gun. 3 people went down with gunshot wounds. And another man, a man named Louis Ferrecki, was so badly injured by a deputy sheriff with his billy club, they'd actually had his skull fractured. And this battle back and forth started to happen with hundreds of picketers fighting with the deputy sheriffs. It lasted until about 6 o'clock that evening, when a thunderstorm rolled through the area. As the thunderstorm comes into the area, and it was like one of these good old-fashioned September, late summer thunderstorms, the streets get cleared and everything is quiet again in Salesville. Until later on that night. And at 10:30 that night, when the next shift change is going to take place for the factory, 500 picketers were out waiting for the workers to both go and enter into the factory. And a rock battle started over again. And throughout the entire evening of September 10th into September 11th, there was a running battle between the picketers, the deputy sheriffs, and the workers within the Salesville factory. And if you got a chance to see the newsreel footage from the beginning of the presentation here today, that's where a lot of that scene takes place. And when I say that all hell breaks loose, it really sounds like it was complete and utter chaos in the Salesville neighborhood. if you remember, if you of a certain age and you remember before there was a 911 system, you'll still see these the fire boxes in some parts of Rhode Island, where you literally had to pull the lever to call the fire department if in case of a fire. Someone throughout the entire neighborhood of Salesville and into Central Falls pulled every single firebox alarm in the area. So every fire truck in Central Falls and Lincoln and even Pawtucket starts to show up at the Salesville factory with just the sirens going and the lights blaring. So it was just complete chaos. In that evening, as things are starting to really escalate and get out of control, Governor Green went on the radio and asked for calm. And this is why the political part of the story is fascinating to me. As he started his broadcast, he was complaining that it was the reactionaries in the state, meaning conservative right-wing forces, that were trying to urge him to call out the National Guard. And what Green said at the time was that it appeared as if the communists were trying to start an insurrection, but the communists at least had the sincerity of their values, according to Green. It was the reactionaries that were causing the problem. The battle continues on throughout the evening, and by 3 o'clock that night, or the next morning, it's quiet in Salesville. Now on Tuesday, September 11th, this is the day that's known as the Battle of the Gravestones. Because of everything that happened over the weekend and on the Monday, it appeared as if almost thousands of people start to show up in Salesville to pay attention to the strike. At one point, the crowd was estimated to be 5,000 people picketing in front of the factory. The deputy sheriffs realized that they were so outnumbered that they called on Governor Green to send in the state police. Well, the state police just added to the problem, because what you'll see here in this picture right here in the middle here, when the state police showed up, what they did was they set up machine gun nests right on the streets and pointed their machine guns at the striking workers. And as they were setting up their machine guns, the crowd grew even bigger. Now, it almost sounds like I'm making this up, but I'm really not. It's part of the newspaper stories. As the crowd starts to swell, and as the state police start to set up their machine guns, a truck from a company called Durastone, which is actually still in Lincoln, it still has a location at the Salesville facility. A big dump truck was loaded with bricks. They were taking all these bricks from Lincoln into Pawtucket because they were building the Pawtucket City Hall. About 3 o'clock that afternoon, this truck starts driving up the street. It passes the state police and starts to drive, slowly through the crowd of the picketers. Well, there's 5,000 people there. They mob the truck and they start taking all of the bricks out of the back of the truck and start piling them on the street. And then they pick up the bricks and start throwing them at the state police. I mean, it's kind of comical to have seen this, but the reports are like there's just mobs of people jumping onto the back of the truck, handing down bricks to their comrades, and they start throwing the bricks at the state police. In response, you can imagine the state police weren't happy, so they start firing tear gas at the picketers. Not only did they start firing tear gas at the picketers, they actually were shooting at them with nausea gas. So they were using these grenades that were filled with chemical warfare agents, trying to make everyone, sick enough where they would throw up and drive them away. So the entire neighborhood of Salesville is filled with tear gas and nausea gas, and the descriptions of it are just amazing. That it was like this fog of war that had descended onto the streets. The workers fought the state police in 3 major areas, and one of them was right in front of the Salesville, the Massachusetts Cemetery. And what happened was that as the tear gas starts to flood the streets and the nausea gas starts to filter in through the crowd, the workers start to filter into the Massachusetts Cemetery, which is right on the backyard side of the Salesville Bleachery. And from the gravestones, they start throwing rocks and bricks at the state police. Well, the state police, not knowing where anyone is, because they can't see anything because of all the gas that they've put into the air, they start shooting. And they're not shooting with the riot guns of the state police. They're shooting with rifles. And as a result, 3 workers get hit by rifle fire. At about 4 o'clock that afternoon, the state police realize that they are now outnumbered and they are, getting attacked and can't control the crowd. So finally, they convince Governor Green that he needs to send in the National Guard, the state militia, to quell the situation. And at about 4 o'clock that afternoon, the National Guard is deployed. There was 100 men from the Field Artillery Division of the National Guard and about 150 people of the 243rd Reserve, which was an air brigade reserve. As the troops start to arrive, they arrive in those big lorry trucks, the big troop moving trucks, and it's this hush descends across the crowd. And as the soldiers start to pile out, they line up on the street in good military order. As they're lining up in the streets, people could be heard yelling at them saying, you'd kill your own mother, go home, you're not welcome here. The soldiers start to put fixed bayonets on their rifles. At the sound of a whistle, they start charging into the crowd. And the crowd, is fighting back with whatever they have at their hands. But the National Guard is now there with hundreds of men, and they have their rifles and their bayonets. The workers start pulling the fire alarms again. They opened up all of the fire hydrants that were in the neighborhood, and they removed the manhole covers from the streets. So as the fire trucks start showing up, all the water from the entire area is flooding onto the streets, and with the manhole covers removed from the sewer caps, all the water from the fire hydrants is going into the sewers, and even the rudimentary wiring that was in place at the time starts to short circuit. So all the lights go out in the neighborhood, all the fire alarms are out. It's absolute chaos. One of the interesting parts of this Battle of the Gravestones things is that at one point during this fight, the workers took the inner tube of a tire and strung it between 2 trees in the Massachusetts Cemetery. And what they were doing is using this tire tube as a giant slingshot. And they would put flower pots, they would put rocks, they would put bottles with nails, and they would use this giant tire as a slingshot to shoot things at the National Guard. This battle would go on and on and on. At about 7 o'clock, the troops pushed the workers back to Dexter Street, which is on its way into Central Falls from Lincoln. And what the striking workers were doing was trying to get all of the lights in the area out. So there's this picture here up in the upper left-hand corner of Tucker Street with the street light up above it. That's a picture from just a couple of years ago. That was the last street light that was left up, and for about an hour, the workers and the National Guard were fighting about who could control this particular street light. And finally, the striking workers were able to get it turned off, but they broke it. So what the National Guard did was actually deploy anti-aircraft lights. So here you have fire trucks, anti-aircraft lights, nausea gas, tear gas, men with guns, rocks, and flower pots being hurled with the inner tubes of tires. It's just absolute chaos. It gets better. Because it was so dark, what the National Guard was doing was using what's called very lights. Now, a very light is a rudimentary flare. Very lights were used in World War I in trench warfare. What would happen is the soldiers would shoot up a very light to see where the enemy was, and then they'd shoot at the enemy or they'd charge. So the soldiers, because all the street lights have been put out and the anti-aircraft lights were deployed, they stopped putting up the very lights so that they could start to see where the strikers were hiding in the graveyard. The strikers do the same thing, except that they're not using very lights, they're using Roman candles. So the strikers are shooting up Roman candles into the air. The soldiers are shooting very lights into the air. And this battle between two opposing armies at this point is just absolute chaos and violence. This would continue into the evening. It would continue overnight up until about 12:30. And then the striking workers just started to filter away after a day-long battle. The next day, September 12th, we turned from the Battle of the Gravestones into the Saylesville Massacre. So around 3 o'clock again, the workers start to gather outside of the factory one more time. Now we're up to about 5,000, 6,000, 7,000 people that are outside the Salesville factory. For whatever reason, the factory is still open and still operating, and the workers are still showing up to work every day at the factory. But about 3 o'clock in the afternoon, workers are hiding again in the Massachusetts Cemetery, and they start throwing rocks at the soldiers. This time, the soldiers don't charge them with their bayonets. They just start shooting at them, and they start shooting at them indiscriminately. The commanders of the National Guard order sharpshooters to be put in position. They actually have some of them on the roofs of the Salesville Bleachery, and they open fire on the crowd. Dozens of people are shot, including, two men. One man was an 18-year-old man named Charles Gozinski. He was shot in the stomach, and another man was named William Blackwood, who was shot in the head. Both would eventually die from their wounds. The crowd would continue to fight up until 8 o'clock that night, when another round of rifle shot into the crowd, and several more people went down. Now, while the Saylesville Massacre was happening, Governor Greene was on the radio, and he had announced that he was asking that a truce had been negotiated between the union and the company, and that the crowd, that there was a ceasefire that was going to be in place. Unfortunately, the troopers, the National Guard, didn't get the word that a ceasefire had been called, and more shots, more people were shot and wounded. Part of the truce that Greene was able to enact was that the Salesville company would be closed, that the Bleachery would finally shut down on September 13th, and that because the thinking that because the company was shut down, the violence would stop because there would be no reason for the people to be picketing out in front of a closed company. This notice here was posted on the bulletin board within the company itself, and this was from the Rhode Island Historical Society's museum library. Actually has a notebook of a scrapbook of things that the company collected during the strike. And this is one of the actual notices that they put up. And if you can, my read on the language here in this notice is that the company was very, very reluctant to shut down. They didn't feel like they had any reason to shut down. And it was only at the insistence of the governor that they did. They weren't happy about it. Here we go. Now, even though the company had shut down, there was still no clear, answer about what was actually going to happen next. So what Governor Greene did was he called the General Assembly into a special session, asking him to get some additional powers to help quell the strike. I have this quotation from him today, and this that he one of the things that he had said to the members of the General Assembly was this: "I have called you together here today, although you were supposed to meet tomorrow, because of a crisis in the affairs of the state. We are face to face now, not with a textile strike, but with a communist uprising." Now, if you remember a little while ago, what I said was at the beginning of the strike, what Greene had told the people of Rhode Island that what was happening, the reason why there was violence in the state was because the reactionaries, the right-wing force of the state, was was being too aggressive and too militant against the strikers. Over the couple of days, in between that, as the working people started to be a little bit more visible, Green changed his tune and started to say that what we're facing here is a communist uprising, that it wasn't a strike at all. The thing of it is that it was not a communist uprising. There were no communists involved. I mean, there were. You'll see in a minute, there were some that were part of the activity, but the Communist Party was kind of a laughingstock in Rhode Island then, as it is now, and they had no influence with working people. In fact, most of the time, they were kind of laughed at by especially by organized labor, but within the larger, lack of a better word, progressive community. However, what Green was trying to do was convince the General Assembly that, in fact, there was this rebellion that was taking place. So he went to the General Assembly and he asked for four things. He asked for $100,000 so he could hire more state police. He asked for $100,000 so he could hire more National Guards troops. He asked for power to close the mills. And he asked for the power to declare a state of insurrection. Now, the reason why he wanted the power to declare a state of insurrection was that that's how he would be able to call the federal government and have federal troops sent to Rhode Island to help quell this uprising. He didn't get any of those. And if you can see that this is the headline from the Providence Journal at the end of that week, the Assembly fails to give Governor Green power to call in federal troops. Well, they gave him no power, actually. It was a real rebuke to Green. At the time, the House of Representatives in Rhode Island was, in fact, governed by the Democratic Party. But the Republicans still controlled the state Senate. And not only to make it even a little bit more complicated, the Democratic House was split into two factions. One was controlled by party boss Tom McCoy, a McCoy field name. The other was the smaller faction, however, were the ones that were loyal to Green. So not only did no one in the General Assembly buy the idea that this was a communist uprising, they deliberately tried to undermine Green because they had little respect for him and didn't think that it would be necessary to give him these extra powers. Not to be dissuaded, though, they did find their communists. This was from a headline in the Providence Journal. Known communists arrested by Providence police today. There's 11 of them. This doesn't exactly look like the most intimidating lot of folks, but what happened was that thanks to the Providence Journal and some other news sources who would try to gin up this idea that the communists were taking over, they rounded up the usual suspects. Why it's kind of comical is that what I was able to determine in my research is that it's kind of like then and now. They were a bunch of college kids, that were, trying to play revolutionary. They were not taken seriously by anyone. And in fact, one of the reasons, or when these people were arrested, they were on their way to go spread leaflets at the Salesville picket line. The problem was that the picket line had already been taken down. And what they were doing was they had a truckload of leaflets that they were going to ask people to come to a rally at the State House on Saturday to protest the governor and the company, putting everyone out on strike. They never even got a chance to do it because the strike was essentially not quite over, but the action had kind of had faded by that point. Another thing that makes the communist part of the story a little bit funny is that on Tuesday that week, the September 11th, there were members of an independent union called the Independent Furniture Workers Union that were arrested for handing out literature in the state. When they were arrested, I mean, it's kind of funny to go back and read some of these news stories. One of the reasons why they were arrested was because one of them had a rubber hose in their car. That was the justification for the arrest. And interestingly, when the group of workers from this independent union showed up in Providence, the Providence police called the Boston police. They called their Red Squad, and they were identified as known agitators. Another person that was arrested was a woman named Ida Alter. And the Providence Journal gave the reason for her arrest as she was apprehended for, quote, being an inflammatory talker and to have possessed more education than the ordinary mill worker. That's what made her a communist. And that's why she got arrested. She was smarter than the average worker. Go figure. However, even though the communists were kind of a joke in Rhode Island, and even though most folks understood that they really had nothing to do with the strike, it didn't stop Governor Green from sending a telegram to every single police department in Rhode Island asking them to round up the usual suspects, to arrest all known communists. Well, they found 15 of them in the state. So it's kind of funny. However, the textile workers union, knowing that the situation in the streets of Salesville was kind of out of control, started to see a way out. And they too started to blame the communists for all of the activity. So Joseph Sylvia, the strike leader in Rhode Island, gave this statement to the Providence Journal. He said, quote, "Communists known for their extreme radical tendencies, including some of the prominent leaders of that group, were active in both Central Falls and Woonsocket. It is our intention as members of the Rhode Island Textile Strike Committee to see that the strike will continue in a peaceful manner, and towards this end we urge all the members of the UTW to rid themselves of communists and their activities." So in other words, everyone got in on the game and started to blame what happened in Salesville on the communists, even though in reality they had nothing to do with it. On September 22nd, the strike officially ended, and it ended as in a loss for the workers. There were no material gains. Everyone went back to work at their factories, and people still faced incredibly harsh conditions, and the speed up continued on. The UTW somehow declared victory, but it was at the time, at least, it was known that that the strike was lost. Now, shortly after the strike ended, the labor movement in the state of Rhode Island was having its convention, and on October 6th, the State American Federation of Labor, which I am now a leader of, held their convention in Newport, Rhode Island. Despite the fact that Governor Green had called out the National Guard, and despite the fact that the Guards members that Governor Green called out killed working people on the streets, the convention endorsed Governor Green for re-election. There was it was not without controversy. What happened was that there was a resolution that was put forward at the convention to censure Green and withhold his endorsement for re-election. But the body voted it down, and they voted it down almost overwhelmingly. It was really a case of realpolitik, I think is probably the best way to describe it. But the president of the American Federation of Labor in Rhode Island at the time, a man named William Conley, said, if we do this, if we rebuke Green, if we pass this resolution, where are we going to get off going to the State House asking for legislation from a Republican governor? And during the debate on the resolution, both Tom McMahon and Joe Sylvia spoke against the resolution, and they actually praised Green. And that's the beginning of this historiography of Green being the master manipulator behind the scenes, trying to get everyone, walking the line in between the company and the striking workers. It was actually the union leaders themselves that put this story forward as a way to deflect blame from themselves. Now, if you know your Rhode Island history, which I'm assuming if you're at a talk like this, you might have some interest in, Governor Green was reelected in November of 1934 to a second term as governor. But what happened shortly thereafter is the Bloodless Revolution. So in January of 1935, Governor Green and a new ally, former adversary Tom McCoy, orchestrated, depending on your point of view, a little bit of it was shady no matter what, but through some backroom maneuvering, they managed to take control of both the Democratic House of Representatives, and they were able to flip the state Senate into Democratic control. And so far, in the Democratic Party in the state of Rhode Island has enjoyed hegemony in the political process of the state ever since. That was the Bloodless Revolution, and I would happily refer people to, there's a great article in Rhode Island History Journal back from the early 1970s, written by Matty Smith, who was a former Speaker of the House of Representatives in Rhode Island, that tells the story of the Bloodless Revolution in great detail, and it's a great read if you haven't read it before. The interesting thing is the Bloodless Revolution is a very Rhode Island way to say it, because the blood still wasn't washed off the streets in Salesville by the time the Bloodless Revolution took place. In the end, 4 men died in Rhode Island during the strike. And I know I focused mostly on the action in Salesville. 3 of the people died in Salesville. There was another person who was killed in Woonsocket. The names were Charles Gazinski, William Blackwood, Jude Contamash, and Leo Ruot, I think is how you say his name. The Salesville part of the story is better known. There's a lot of work that probably needs to be done on what happened in Woonsocket. It's part of the story. It's a completely fascinating story in and of itself, and it's just waiting out there to be told. But this monument here on the right-hand side was erected in the Massachusetts Cemetery by the Rhode Island Labor History Society in 2010, and it has the names of the victims of the Saylesville Massacre on it. And then on the left-hand side of your screen, that's a picture of me next to one of the gravestones in the Massachusetts Cemetery that still has 2 bullet holes in it, where the workers were hiding behind the gravestones. And if you're ever in the area, what you can see is that these bullet holes come from the backside of the grave. The sharpshooters were on the roof of the factory, about 100, maybe 200 yards from where this picture is taken, and shooting down from the roof of the factory into the graveyard. And someone was hiding behind this gravestone. It's not clear whether or not they were killed. So I'm going to stop there and open things up for questions if people have them. If you want a little bit more of an in-depth version of this story, you can actually buy a copy of my book called The Battle of the Gravestones and the Salesville Massacre of 1934. You can go to this website, www.salesvillemassacre.com. You can actually buy it on Amazon, too, if you do a search for the book title on Amazon. So I'm going to stop there. I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and we'll open things up for questions, if people have them. So it's an interesting way to do this presentation, not having the visual reaction, being able to hear from people during feedback during the presentation. So I just want to say thank you everyone for being here, and if anyone has questions, I guess you can either put them in the chat, or maybe if you want to unmute, you could ask them.
Do we want to do it where people put it in the chat and then I can read them, just so we don't have people trying to talk all at once?
And Matt Gunnup, thank you very much for posting the link to the 1973 Rhode Island History Journal article. I appreciate that. It's a fascinating read if you haven't read it. I'm going to scroll up here if there's... I'm sorry, I'm trying to look at the question. What is the name of the cemetery? So the name of the cemetery was the Massachusetts Cemetery.
So we have some questions now.
Okay.
Were there women among the strikers?
So the answer is yes. In fact, it's part of the story that I initially went into this story with a completely different understanding. Some of the reporting at the time of the strike, they talk about this story called the girl in the green sweater, or sometimes just the girl in green. And this young woman apparently would show up at these picket lines in Salesville and then in Woonsocket and then across the entire region. And she would be this amazing orator. She would hurl communist rhetoric at the security forces and would lead brigades of men into battle with the cops. Turns out none of it was really true. Her name was Rita Brule, I think is how you say her name. She was a 16-year-old woman. She was definitely there. She was definitely arrested in the strike. She was not a worker at the Salesville factory. In fact, she wasn't employed at all. And it really seems like even though she was arrested for throwing rocks at the members of the National Guard, the story of this young woman leading these battles against the security forces, it really, upon further look, was just made up. So now there were women that were active in the strike itself, but again, the story is kind of oddly told, and it still needs to be some work developed. So, for example, one of the women that was a leader of the United Textile Workers Union was her name was Elizabeth Nord, and Elizabeth Nord was a woman from Pawtucket, and she was at the time one of the only national labor leaders who was a woman. Unfortunately, when it comes to this story, she actually wasn't involved much in the action in Salesville or Woonsocket. She was stationed down in Westerly during the strike. Now, if you want an interesting little side note of how history kind of intersects, Elizabeth Nord is actually buried in the Massachusetts Cemetery now. She died, I want to say 2006, and her gravestone, her family plot, is in the Massachusetts Cemetery. If anyone's looking for an interesting kind of further research, some of my friends that are in the LGBTQ community claim Elizabeth Nord as one of their own, and was one of the first LGBTQ organizers. They always want me to say, when I say this, be mindful of the fact it was a different time and a different era in the United States, and she was never out. But it's a lot of the stories that get told about Elizabeth Nord are part of that community's history. So it's this intersection of history that's really fascinating.
Okay, another question. Is the factory still there? I usually take photos of the old factories, and this is the first I've heard of Salesville.
It is still there. It is it's a workout studio. There is a couple of artists have lofts there. There's a coffin factory there. The Salesville, there's actually a fencing academy, swords, that it's there. I mean, it's a really fascinating building. When you walk inside, there's narrow hallways, and then you open up these doors with these giant rooms. And right next to it is actually one of the buildings as part of this complex is now apartment buildings, but it's still there. Allegedly, I haven't been able to find it. Allegedly, you can find bullet holes in the walls where there was, some of the National Guard was shooting at the building at one point. So it's just, it's still there. It's still giant. It's still hulking. But it's no longer a factory.
All right, next question. Before you mentioned there was a Woonsocket component to the strike activity, I noticed a smaller article in the first newspaper article you shared with us that referred to workers being attacked in Woonsocket. Was this referring to the same series of events?
Same strike, different events. And it's one of the reasons why I wanted to tell the Salesville story apart from the Woonsocket story. So, and if you get a chance to attend the Museum of Work and Culture, you'll see one of the rooms that is on the second floor of the museum is a recreation of a union hall from a union, the independent, Deborah, help me out with the name. It's the ITU is the name of the union. The ITU is the name of the union. And they were a different breed. I mean, it was this fascinating union that was only in Woonsocket, only represented textile workers, was very French Canadian based, not even French American based. I mean, it was really French workers, French Canadian workers made this union for themselves in Woonsocket and had this subculture all to themselves. And at the beginning of the National Textile Strike, they refused to have their workers go out on strike. So for the first week, they stayed on the job in Woonsocket. And it wasn't only until things got crazy in Salesville that the ITU ended up joining the strike activity. And what happened was during the second week of the strike, as Salesville was erupting, a similar riot took place in what was known as the Social District in Woonsocket. And there's not a lot of work that's been done on the events in Woonsocket during the strike. There's slightly more about Salesville, but very few have been done in Woonsocket. And I think it's part of the story that's waiting to be told, because I think there's a French Canadian element to it that is a fascinating part of our history that is waiting to be explored.
All right, another question. I was surprised that people were still showing up for shifts with the strike going on. Didn't this also cause more difficulties?
It did. It was. I think at the time, they were showing up. The factory was open, and remember, in 1934, there were very few worker protections that were on the books. Either in the state or in the federal government. You didn't show up, you got fired. And it's 1934. It's the middle of the Depression. People that were working were lucky to have a job. So if you didn't show up for your shift, you were gonna lose your job. And in fact, at the end of the strike, in the strike scrapbook that's at the Rhode Island Historical Society's library, they actually created a blacklist of people that were never to be hired again at the Salesville factory. Most of them are the people that were arrested during the strike, but there were a few people who didn't show up for work, and they were told, you're not coming back. And Salesville, especially in the neighborhood where I used to live, it's all mill housing. So it was company houses. The company owned the house. The company owned the clubhouse where you went. The company owned the church. The company owned the factory store that paid you in script. So you were sacrificing a lot if you didn't go to work. And in the book I go into this in a little bit more detail. The paternalism of the Sales family was so ingrained in the neighborhood that people literally saw themselves as part of the family. And if you can imagine the 1930s in Rhode Island, it is a seismic change that's starting to happen in the demographics of the state. So the people that worked and lived in Salesville were old English stock, I guess is the best way to say it. They were people that emigrated from England over 100 years ago. And then another group of folks were Irish descent, but had been in the United States for 75, 100 years. So they were at that point, white Americans. While right next door in Central Falls and in Pawtucket and a lot of other parts of the state, you're starting to see waves of European immigration from Southern Europe and more Central Europe. So you're seeing a lot of Serbian people. Actually, there was a large Serbian community at the time in Central Falls. A lot of Italian workers, a lot of Central European, Hungarian workers, that were coming into the state, a second wave of Irish immigration that was coming into the state. So you have this cultural component of, people that didn't see themselves as the same class of or same group of immigrants, even though they were only a couple of generations removed. So it's all of these elements that are combining into why I think people still showed up for work.
All right, we have some comments. Okay. Oh, any descendants of the Salesville family still around in Rhode Island?
I assume so, but I don't know. There were folks back about 50 years ago in reading some of the newspaper reports when there's a couple of buildings at Brown University that are named for the Sales family, and like I said, Sales Hall I think is still there. And one article I found from like 1970 was talking about they were renovating Sales Hall at Brown, and a descendant of Frank Sales was there in attendance, but that person was already older and elderly. So if they are, I'm not really sure.
If there are descendants of the family, do you think they would have artifacts of this time, and would they share them?
Good question. One of the things I've been trying to find is, are people with artifacts. I mean, one of the struggles that labor historians face is, working people don't have a lot, especially, especially in the Depression era. A lot of people weren't literate, so people didn't keep diaries. But I won't go back and share the screen. One of the pictures that I have as part of the presentation was a headline, and it shows one of the National Guards people that was hit in the head with a rock, if you call it. It's from a Boston newspaper, and actually one of the you might actually be on the Zoom here. One of the times when the Labor History Society held our annual event at Mashastic Cemetery, this man from the neighborhood, well, I think he was formerly from the neighborhood, came to the event, and he had a copy of this newspaper from 1934 that I think he said his mother saved from the time of the strike. But other than there's not a lot of that stuff that's there. The sales company kept some records, and like I said, there's this beautiful scrapbook at the museum at the Rhode Island Historical Society in their collection, but it's mostly newspaper clippings from around the country. The most fascinating part of I thought was in addition to the blacklist, which is about 40 or 50 names. There's a copy of a Chicago newspaper about the strike, and it shows a police officer hitting a striker with the club, and there's a note attached to it, and it's hard to say who the note is from, but it's from another factory owner in the Midwest, and the note says something along the lines of, "Thank God you guys took care of business in Rhode Island before it spread out here." I mean, it's just this fascinating little piece of history.
All right, I don't see any more questions. Patrick, if you want to scroll up and just see if we missed anything. Lots of thanks. Great talk.
Yeah. I think that's it for questions. Well, then let me do this by wrapping up, and then I'll turn it back over to you, Deborah.
Okay.
Thanks everyone for being here. I really appreciate it. It's too bad we couldn't do this in person, but hopefully sometime soon we'll be able to get back to the Museum of Work and Culture. And I know there's a number of other interesting Valley talks that'll be coming up in the very near future. So let me say thank you, and I'll turn things over to you, Deborah, so you can talk a little bit more about that.
Sure. I'm just going to be dropping links to the upcoming Valley Talk info pages in the chat. So sorry, I'm just navigating to to February of 2022. Or actually, you know what? I think it'll be just easier if I put in the events calendar for RIHS. But yeah, we've got a great lineup. The next talk is going to be the 23rd of January, and then the last talks will be there'll be one on the 6th of February, the 20th of February, and then the 6th of March. And they're all free to attend, and they're going to be great. So I think I'm going to turn off the recording, and thank you all so much.